between now and 11, I'd like to go over chapter 7 in our ASP.NET class so you can see where we are. We're right on schedule. Again, next week we'll do 8 and 9. The following week we'll do 10 and 11. And by that Tuesday, I'll have your assignment. So by the 30th, I'll have your next assignment. And again, it'll be pushed off 3 weeks just like the last one. That's going to be the last assignment that you're going to get from this book. All right? And so you'll have a week of lab, the week of October 6th. Then in here, we may be able to do this in 2 weeks instead of 3. We'll see. But I'd like to go over the database stuff. I'm going to go over some examples with you, but I'm not going to assign anything from there. All right? But we will go over and spend some time on chapter 24 of the book you have, because I think it's 24 at least, is an introduction to Model View Controller. And the hope is the last part of this this class, that is chapter 24, we're going to go over a project that we're going to build together using Model View Controller architecture. All right? So, also to let you know, for this afternoon, it's not real good, but this is my Guess Your Number program for PHP. All right, I'm going to show you the code for it this afternoon. Again, it's not perfect, but I come in here and I can 50. Guess is too high. Guess again. Notice if I leave it blank, no guess made, try again. If I put in something that's non-numeric guess, try again. If I put in something that's out of range, either on the high end or on the low end, you get a message. All right. Okay, does that make sense? So we're going to go over that one this afternoon. I did not finish the other one I told you I would do, that future value one, so we'll go over that next week. So I'll just spend an hour today going over this one. Probably won't even take an hour. I'm going to give you hard copies of the code. If you want to key it in, you'll be able to. All right. If you want to create your own, or if you've been working on your own, that's more than fine too. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you next week in PHP as a lab also, because I can sense some of the frustration people are having because you're starting to get deluged between this class, other IT classes, and other classes, period, with homework. So we'll have next week be a lab also in PHP, and actually that's probably about the only class that's going to be a lab. Okay, we're going to go over next week between Monday and Wednesday in C. We're going to go over the rest of that book. I talked to Terry Prindle this morning, and I've asked him if next Thursday between 3 and 5 we can have a meeting, we meaning me, and IT can have a meeting regarding those servers. I'm waiting for them to get back to me, because there's like 7 people who want to be involved in this meeting. So. Like I said, we'll go over this program later. Notice I tried to use colors. All right, red meaning required, and green meaning you guessed it. And if you put in something that was wrong, it's also in red. Okay, so I'll show you all that stuff. It's not a real long program. I did it. Again, you may like the way I did it. You may not like the way I did it. But either way, that's fine. So, chapter 7 starts in your book on page 231, and it's on how to use the validation controls. So that's the plan today, to go over that between now and about 11 o'clock or so. Again, if we get done earlier than that, it's no big thing. Now, much of this information we've already had, because we've already gone over like an introduction to the validation controls, and I don't agree with what the author says. Okay, not like this is a big thing, but the author mentions that when you come in here and you go and you view your toolbox, which is what I'm going to try to do in just a second. View. Toolbox, there we go. All right. So when you go in and you start looking at this, all the tools that are discussed in this chapter are in here. All right. And the author says that there are 6 validator tools. the compare validator, the custom validator, the range validator, the regular expression validator, the required field validator, and the validation summary. I don't consider the validation summary to be a validator. All it is it literally is a summary. All right, so into it itself, it works in conjunction with the other validators. We've talked about these again a little bit before, but just as a quick little overview, the compare, they'll give you several examples, but one of the major ways that you're going to use this is if you have somebody log in and you have them put in their password and then repeat it, you can use compare to make sure that the two passwords are the same. The custom validator, if you remember in the Java program that you're doing right now, or one of the ones that you're working on, what was it? The employee number had to be like number dash letter or something like that from A to M. You could write a custom validator to do that. All right. Range validator, if you wanted dates to be within a certain range or an age to be within a certain range or whatever. All right. And remember, with all these, it's very important that when you're using these, especially the compare, the custom, and the range, to put the type in there. We've talked about this before, and some of you have been bit by that already, because remember, it defaults to string. All right, so you may not have it work the way that you expect that it'll work. Regular expression, there are regular expressions built into the regular expression validator for social security number, phone number, email address, etc. You can build your own. Towards the end of the chapter, they give you a couple pages on regular expressions. We've already discussed some of that stuff, so we won't spend much time on it. Required field validator, that may be the most important one, all right, and it's probably the easiest to implement. And then again, the validation summary. So we'll look at all those because, as mentioned, that's what the chapter is about, all right? So to begin with on 232, and I'm just going to be bouncing back and forth as I usually do between here and the code on the next page. Again, that's where the author says there's 6 controls, but whatever, all right? So they're going to be summarized on the next page, but let's quickly take a look at what the author says here. It says, to refresh your memory about how validation controls work, this figure summarizes the key points. To start, realize that validation tests are typically done on the client before posted to the server. So if you've got unobtrusive validation set up and you've used that NuGet that we talked about in an earlier chapter to bring in the jQuery, then you already have your client-side validation set up. If you've already done your client-side validation, so if you've done that already, so if you've got NuGet, you've got client-side, or I'm sorry, server's client-side validation that's already being done for you, but you want to turn that off, all you have to do is go to the unobtrusive validation property and set it to false. If you do that, then it'll only validate on the server side. All right. Now notice on here, because this is kind of an important point, it says realize that the required field validator works a bit differently. When you use this validator, the validation isn't done until you click the button to basically, like, you know, go to another field or whatever. So it's a little different in that if you look up on the screen here, that if we come in and let's grab one of these. Break. All right, so if I bring this out, for instance, if I go up to the order page here, all right, and we look at that in design mode, and we've got fields in here that are required. You can see right now, for example, that quantity is a required field. All right, what the author says is that when you run this, let's just imagine that we had a bunch of fields in here. We only have one that's required, but let's just pretend we had a bunch of them. All right. Really, you have no idea as to the order in which you're going to fill this out. So again, when I go and run this, so if I try to bring this particular, the order one up, again, probably not the best example to choose. I probably should have used one of the checkouts. But right now, notice if I click in quantity, all right, and then I click off of it, okay, it's not doing anything. It's only when I click the add to cart that I get that. All right. So again, if you've got several required field validators, they're not going to typically kick in until you've, now if I come through here and I put 56, boom, fine. It's going to put that in there, not a problem. So I'm going to go back to continue shopping. And I come in, I've got Austin Powers here. And let's say that I put in 5. But now I come back here and say, oh, that's not the one I want. I wanted black light. Now I remove this. All right. See how it, when I put something in there and then removed it, how it kicked in also? Because the system supposed that you already put a value in, it was required, and you took the value out. So what I'm saying is when you first get into a field that's got required validators, if you don't click in it and put anything there, that doesn't kick in until you actually click a button that's got the causes validation to set to true. All right? Unless you come in, like I just showed you, and you manually put something in and then remove it. All right? And that's what the author mentions there. Probably better than I did, but that's what he's talking about right here. All right? He also talks again about the NuGet stuff and what you have to do. And we've already gone over that, but notice when, again, as it says, when ASP.NET performs validation tests on the server, it sets the isValid property of each validator to true or false. What that means is, if you've got a really, for lack of better words, kind of an ugly thing in here, let me stop the run on this again. And we'll bring up the checkout page. Checkout too. I don't remember. Maybe they didn't build it. I thought that they did on here. We've got an order page. Oh, it's the regular checkout page. There we go. All right. So all the stuff that's on here, you notice there's quite a few validators. All right. And going back to what the author just said right here, each one of these has got an isValid property that's going to be set to true. For instance, if I do put an email address in there, then the required field validator for that will be set to true. If I don't, it'll be set to false. All right? If I leave it blank. If I put a non-valid email, the required might be set to true, but the validator for the email will be set to false. Does all that make sense? I mean, it probably sounds pretty simplistic. All right? But the important thing to realize about that is what the author is saying is that when you click a button and you say you want to go to a card page or you want to do a whatever, the system's got to go through and find every one of those validators to see whether or not it's set to true or false. And again, the required field validator may not be even clicking in until this time if you left the field blank. Only if all of those required fields and compare validators and all the other ones, only if they all succeed will you go to your next page. And that's what the author is saying right here. Then the isValid property for the entire form will be set to true. Otherwise, it's going to be set to false. And that's, so, again, those are the validators. And this is what I just mentioned right there. If page.isValid. That will literally go in and check every single one of these. And if it finds any that are not valid, all right, it's going to hold you there until you make them valid. All right, so talking about some common validator attributes and properties. Some of these I mentioned to you already. As it says, the display property determines how the error message validator is displayed. I would suggest always setting that to dynamic, which means you only generate the space for the error if there is an error. Otherwise, you're not leaving a bunch of space in there that's unnecessary. It defaults, though, to static, which means it always has that much area. So you have to manually go in and set the display from static to dynamic if you don't want it there. All right. The error message in the text, it's a little bit confusing, but notice what it says. You use the error message in the text to specify messages displayed when the validator detects an error. You can set one or you can set both of them, depending on whether or not you're using a validation summary control, which we're going to get to in a couple pages. If you want the same message in both the validator and the summary control, just set the error text message. Sometimes, though, what you want is your text message is just an asterisk, meaning it's a required field. So you put that there and you maybe make it red. Then you set the error, that's what you put in for the text. For the error message, that's what you want to display in the validator. All right, but again, how you set that up is up to you or judged by the requirements that you're given. All right. Remember that the most important property on this, everybody listening, you don't have to look, but please listen. The most important property is when you bring out one of these validators, you better set the control to validate, because it doesn't matter where you place it. All right, it only knows what to validate when you set the control to validate property. There's an enabled property, as it says. It's on by default. It's set to true, but you can turn it off if you want to turn off validation for whatever reason. There's other things too, but the major ones are those that are explained right there. All right. The unobtrusive validation, again, the author talked about this before and explains here on page 237 how you get into NuGet. This is me speaking, so what I'm about to say you may or may not agree with, but to me, the hoops that they make you jump through to do this, there should be a simpler way to do it. And what I'm saying is, remember, right now, basically, the two options that we have are you choose that you want to just set up a regular project, which sets up a bunch of stuff you don't need and probably have to get rid of, all right? Or you set up a blank project when you have to bring this in every time. All right, I wish they had it set up when you have a blank project where it would say something, you know, like a checkbox that says, would you like NuGet installed for this project? I think that'd make it a lot easier to use, but that's just me speaking. All right, so again, they explain here how to do it. Hopefully everybody has gone through that now. I know some of you struggled with it a little bit, but hopefully everybody got it done and got it to work. All right, so starting with the required field validator, again, they give you some examples in here on page 239. And if we look, the first example that's in here, the validator is used to check the required entry in a text box. There's the control to validate, and there's the error message. You know, you should be striving to not have a generic message that just says like required. Let them know what's required. All right. It may, you know, maybe something as simple as name is required. Something like that. Here's one that checks if an initial value has changed. We've all seen these, right? When you've got, for example, if you've got a drop down and it tells you to put a date in there, then at the top it just shows that that's the format that you're going to use, month, day, year, year. Or if you've got credit cards, it says select a credit card type of thing. All right, whether you're using a list box or a text box or whatever. Okay. And again, do you make every field a required field? Well, it depends on what the form says, what your requirements say. But again, examples of ones that you typically won't set a required field for. If you've got a form that you're setting up and you've got an area in there for comments, quite often you won't make that a required field. Some people just don't like to write comments, period. All right. Compare validators, again, we've already talked about. In the first example that you see here on 241, all right, all this says is you have to have an integer, and the integer has to be greater than 0. So you need to put in a positive integer for quantity. All right, that is a compare validator. But again, you have to make sure you set the type and the operation and the value that you want to compare that to, in addition to the control to validate. Again, hopefully looking at that, it just makes sense. And you will be doing this for the second assignment. All right. The next one, this just says, is the type an integer? So notice the difference. There's no value to compare to. All right. So technically, this one would allow for negative values. Now, that may not make sense for a quantity, but they're just showing it to show you that you don't have to have a value to compare to. All right. And then finally, the last one that's in here compares two different things. Okay. And here it makes sure that the text end date is greater than the start date. Now, and again, that's greater than, but there also is a greater than or equal to. I mean, no matter, depending on what this was, this is some kind of a date. But if this was a to-do list, it would be possible that the end date would be the same date as the start date. So, but you would always want to say something like end date greater than or equal to start date. You'd never want to allow an end date to come before a start date. All right. I think what you're going to be working on for the next project is you're going to make a reservation form, like for a mythical hotel. And one of the things that you put in there is you don't want to allow the person the check out date You know, you ask them for a check-in date and a check-out date. The check-out date can't happen before the check-in date, type of thing. And really the check-in date and the check-out date, when you think about it, all right, should have to be today's date or less, or beyond rather, right? You shouldn't be able to check in for a date that's already passed, in other words. Now notice what they mentioned on the previous page. I just want to say this. This is a little quirky. It says when you work with compare validators, you should know that if the user doesn't enter a value into the control will pass the test, because there's nothing in it. So if you're going to use a compare validator, it's imperative you must also have a required field validator to make sure that the test works correctly. So you always want to test this stuff and have a few test cases to run over this stuff to make sure that indeed it's working the way you want it to work. As it says, you should also realize if you compare the value of a control against another control, the test will pass if the user doesn't enter a value into the other control. All right? Or if that value can't be converted to the correct type. So as it says, to avoid this problem, make sure the other control is also validated properly. So if you're going to validate two dates, you want to make sure they're both, you know, a start date and an end date, you want to make sure the controls are set up similarly for each. They're both required, they're both of type date, etc. And then when you do the compare in the right way. Question? They're on in a drop down. Yeah. All right, the range validator, and again, I realize we've talked about a lot of these. There's two examples here on page 243 that you see. The first example that you see right there, it validates user input, making sure it falls within a given range. Okay, so notice we've set a minimum and a maximum. All right. So, for instance, I think this is one very similar that says, you know, how long do you want to check in for? So they imagine that, for example, if it was like a hotel type of thing, that you're going to check in for, you know, stay over for a minimum of 1 day and a maximum of 2 weeks. And that actually makes sense. All right, that doesn't mean it wouldn't be possible for you to put in more than 14. But if you put in a value of more than 14, you're going to get that message. You might want to change it and say, please contact us directly if you plan on staying here for more than 14 days. All right. And they show you here how you can set a date at runtime. So notice we've got the ID, we've got the type here, but we're setting the minimum and we're setting the maximum. And why would you do that? It's for the same reason I showed you before, so please look at this. Because again, for the example that you're going to do for your next assignment, when you do this check-in thing, this is really the way you should do it. You shouldn't be setting it like this. You should be setting it like this, because it says that the minimum value for the date is today's date. And the maximum value, for example, so when do you want to book for? And you can book anytime between now and 30 days from now type of an idea. All right. And again, if you're not reading the book, and I have no idea if you are or not, there's a lot of really good stuff in the book. Really and truly there is. I go back and read it and read it again a lot of times, and I always pick up something else. All right. Next is the regular expression validator, and as already mentioned, notice some of the ones that you get in here that are set by default. So if you click on phone number, it gives you this. It's a little bit more refined version of the one that I went through with you when we talked about validation in PHP. But what that says is you can have an optional, it's optional, parentheses in there, but then you need 3 digits followed by a space, followed by 3 digits and a dash, followed by 4 digits type of thing. You'll know when you set it up. Social security number will be number, 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 dash, number, number, dash, number, 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 number. All right. And notice they also, when you go in here, there are a lot more options than what are shown. So for instance, if you're doing a European type of phone number, I think they have French and English, and for England and some other ones that are in there. And if you don't like any of them, you can come in there to the validation expression and create your own. So let's say you did this for the US phone number, but you didn't, that was almost what you wanted, but not quite. So you've got the 3 digits, the dash, the 3 digits, the dash, and the 4 digits, but you don't want any of the rest of that. So you can come in there and you can remove all the rest of it. See what I'm saying? So you can customize. You can even start with nothing in there and put in your own expression if you want. You typically don't do that from the validation expression. You typically do it from the next one, which is the custom expression. But you can do it like that too. All right, some examples. Again, that would be for a zip code. But remember, that example that they show here on page 245, all that allows for is a 5-digit zip code. You typically would want either a 5-digit or 5 digits, a dash, and 4 digits. All right. And again, here's another example with U.S. phone numbers. So they give you a couple pages here on regular expressions. We've gone over a lot of this stuff that's in here. Never hurts to review it. Remember that you always start a regular expression with a caret sign. You always end it with a dollar sign. Same stuff that we had in PHP. All right, and PHP, this stuff works the same way in PHP. A little d matches any digit. A big D matches any non-digit. All right, a little w, as it says, matches a word character, so alphanumeric. A big W matches anything other than an alphanumeric. They work pretty much the same way in virtually any kind of programming language. All right, a little s, as it says, matches any white space. A big S, any non-white space. This would be A or B or C or D. This would be anything but A or B or C or D. Any lowercase alphabetic letter, exactly that many occurrences. All right, at least that many occurrences, a range of occurrences, 0 or more occurrences, 0 or 1 occurrence, 1 or more occurrence. All right, anything, and this is like using like an or, and grouping. You just use that for grouping. All right, that's pretty much all of them. And we've talked about examples, and they give some pretty good examples in here on the bottom of page 247. So I don't think there's anything in here that we haven't already talked about in other classes. All right, the custom validator, again, typically that you use the custom validator so you can write your own because there's nothing that exactly matches in the other validators that we looked at. All right, so when you bring it up, as it says, all right, and we just look in here, it says it shows you how to use the custom validator. In the example, a custom validator is used to check a value entered by a user that it's a valid product code. So you literally set up the way that you want it to look. Okay? I haven't done a lot of work with this one. All right. What is new in this chapter that we have not really talked about before starts on page 250, and it goes from 250 on to the next 4 pages or so, and that is talking about this validation summary control. What that does is this. See that? That's the validation summary. And you've got your choice with the validation summary typically on the top or on the bottom. Some people find it very intrusive to put it on the top, all right, especially considering that you usually format it so it's in red so it stands out. Other people like it for that reason. Now you're showing the person exactly where they screwed up. All right, and you'll notice here that please correct these entries. So notice it says first email and second email, so there's different error text here than there is text for the validator itself. All right. So there's a lot of good information on page 250. So the figure here that you see up above, as it says, it shows you the different stuff that you put in there. So to display different messages, you set the error message property. That's the stuff that you want to show in the validation control, and the text property is what you want it to show in the validator itself. All right. If you don't want any individual error messages in the summary control, just set the header text property to a generic message you want it to display. Please correct the following errors type of thing if you want it to just say that. Okay. By default, error messages are displayed as a bulleted list, as they show right here. But you can change that. You can turn off the bullets. You can have your own types of bullets. You can literally set it up so instead of being an unordered list, you can make it an ordered list. You can just go in there and add some CSS to make it do virtually whatever it is you want it to do. All right. To format it, you use the appearance properties that are shown at the top here, the display mode, the header text, the show summary, and the message box. And the author at least claims this is easier than using CSS because it's hard to tell what elements are generated for a summary control. So you'll typically use these. You can still go in with CSS, and as long as you use everything and make it, use them generically, so you get the same coloring, the same everything, you should be fine too if you want to do it that way. Again, if you use a bulleted list, they mentioned on the bottom of page 250, the error messages will be in the items within an add item, so you can apply CSS to those. So again, if you wanted more spacing than what's shown there, or again, if you wanted a different kind of bullet as opposed to what they show, etc., you can do that. You can also use validation groups, and they show the example. This is what you'd use it most often for. Again, if you put a checkbox there that says same as billing address and they check it, all right, you can either leave this off. You could literally have it disappear then if you wanted to. You could have it manually fill in for you right on the screen if they check that, all right, or you could just leave it blank. But by putting this in there, you're grouping together in a validation group the billing address and the shipping address. So you're grouping all that stuff together, and what you're saying is if you click this, copy everything that's in this group to this group. Does that make sense? That's usually how you would use it, is the way they show it right here. That's a really, I think at least it's a pretty good example. All right, they do show you a little bit in here with code, and the first one is what we just mentioned, and the second one it says a button that starts the validation of a group. Well, notice that's telling it to validate everything. All right, so the same validation group equals ship to, that means run through all of them before you actually go and run this routine. Okay. So grab it and hold it as a group. You can also conditionally validate in code as a group. Okay. All right, the rest of the chapter, there's only about 8 more pages, talks about this checkout page, starting on page 254. So this is the checkout page. All right. At the top of the page, there is a validation summary control, and in addition, on the right-hand side are individual validators. Now, you'll notice that there is not a field in here other than state that is required. All right. And remember that right here, if email address is a required field, the only way you see the word required in there is if you leave it off, correct? But if you put in an invalid email address, you get that message. Since you put in an invalid email address at here, and at the bottom it's a valid one, all right, you get the message not must be a valid email address, but must match first entry. So that would be a compare validator. All right, so you'd have required, all right, and you'd have required here and a compare validator, etc. You'd have some kind of a regular expression validator here for the email. This would be a required field. That would be a required field. That would be a required field with a regular expression validator. That would be a required field. That would be a required field. That would, and the zip code. And the zip code, I believe, must be 5 characters from what they showed us earlier. So if you break any of those rules, all right, it's not going to work. You put that stuff in and you click the checkbox, and either, again, it will fill that stuff out for you automatically if you tell it to, or it'll just copy it over their period code and not even show you. All right, depends on what you want to have happen. So the code to make this happen, let's look first at the ASPX code here on page 257. The first block of code that's in there, all right, the first thing that you see in here shows you both. Notice there's the regular expression validator right there. So you can see, again, that's really ugly. You don't have to set that up. You go into the regular expression validator and you click the option that says email address, and that's set up for you. I'd recommend using what they show right there. They're very time tested. All right, they should work without a problem. In the shipping code, again, there's the code in there that determines if the shipping address is the same as the mailing address. All right. And again, they do that with a group in here. They do mention on the previous page, I just want to say this to you. Notice to make this form right, the auto postback property of the checkbox is set to true. Think about what that means. All right? On this, if I check this button, what that's saying is copy everything from my billing address to my shipping address. That should make sense to you. But if I uncheck it, all right, then what I basically want to do is say don't copy it. All right? That's why they've got this, basically it's set up here, as they mentioned down here. That's why the auto postback is set to true, because if you change it, if you either click it to make it checked or click it again to uncheck it, you've got to go back and write that back to the server, because it has to know either to copy that information to the shipping address or take it off if it was copied previously to the shipping address. All right. As far as the code that does this, and this is the end of the chapter right here. All right, so as far as the code that you see right here, let's take a look at what it is. Okay, first, the first thing that you see in here, and I think they only highlight a couple things that are in here. They say you've looked at the other stuff already. But it says first the get customer data method, all right, that you see right here. Not only does it get the data for the contact information and the billing address, but also the data for the shipping address, because it has to make sure that indeed that stuff matches or doesn't match, depending on whether or not you checked it. All right. Second, the event handling that's in there. The check changed event that you see right here where the mouse is currently sitting, what that does is that control is automatically, all right, that control is automatically fires when you either check the checkbox or uncheck the checkbox. And that's what the author is saying right there. All right, and that's pretty much it. Now, what I'd like to do, because it's only 10:38, all right, and this is going to actually put us ahead a little bit, but unless anybody has a big problem with this, I'd like to take our break a little bit early today and then come back and go over Chapter 8. I know Teresa, as an example, mentioned having some angst over the session state stuff. So I figured if we went over it now, because the first assignment you had some session state stuff in it. So I thought maybe we could go over this now and look at it, and hopefully it'll help answer questions that people had. So it's 10:40. Let's come back at 10:50, and we'll try to make sure that we're done somewhere around 11:15 to 11:30. All right, and then that puts us ahead as opposed to behind.